chance to see if the machine is working properly so that we may begin our interview. Yes. Testing, testing. Well, perhaps we can begin by asking Professor Blanshard when you first met John Dewey and under what circumstance.
Well, I had spent 2 years in the Orient, in India and Mesopotamia, in the early days of the First World War. And when I came back to the United States in the summer of 1917, I wanted, if I could, without first serving my military term, work with John Dewey at Columbia. I was placed in limited service in the Army, which meant that I had to wait my turn to be called up. And fortunately, I wasn't called up until the summer, late in the summer of 1918. So I went to Columbia and enrolled as a graduate student, primarily to work with Mr. Dewey. I came to know him fairly well in the course of the year, and at the end of the academic year, went with him for the summer to Philadelphia.
This is the Polish experiment, then?
That's right, yes.
What can you tell us about this?
Well, perhaps I ought to say something first about the year I spent in studying with him.
Yeah, pardon.
I came with a good deal of English philosophy in my system, and I was looking forward with great curiosity to see what my eminent American teacher was going to be like. I remember the first lecture I heard from Dewey in his class in social philosophy. He wasn't at first a very satisfying apparition. He came shuffling into the room, looking rather absent-mindedly over the top of his spectacles. He sat down in a chair on the rostrum, looked out of the window, and began crumpling a single sheet of notepaper, which usually served as a sufficiency of notes, and began to talk. His speech was, in a way, that of the Vermont farmer. Always, in a sense, Dewey was a Vermont farmer. He was the least imposing of teachers or philosophers. He never tried to put his best foot forward. He seemed to have no sense of the dramatic, still less of the melodramatic. He never tried to pass himself off as a great man. He had none of the arts of oratory. He usually sat during his lectures, looked out the window, and lectured in what seemed to me, after my experience of philosophers abroad, he spoke in a rather mumbling fashion. But I found when I got home and went over my notes that what seemed in the hearing to be a rather inconsecutive and rambling discourse was really very closely knit and carefully thought out. My wife, who was then not yet my wife, but was a graduate student at Columbia, sat on the front row, and I sat near the back row, where on occasion I could peacefully nap. I borrowed her notes for examination purposes, and she observed him from close range much more sharply than I did. She was able to report the untidinesses of his apparel and various other things that on the back row I never observed. He was a very kindly person, very generous, without any side, easily approachable, extremely absent-minded. I remember that I used to work in the Butler Library on the top floor of Philosophy Hall in Columbia, where Dewey had an adjoining office. And I've seen Dewey emerge from his door, walk out into the middle of the large study room, look round him in some surprise, find himself there, and then turn and become a fugitive in his office again. I didn't see much of him outside of class in that year of study, but here begins the adventure in Philadelphia. Mr. Albert C. Barnes was a student in Dewey's social philosophy seminar.
It's the same class that you attended?
No, it was another. I attended Dewey's undergraduate lecture course in social and political philosophy, but this graduate course was another one. I was not a member of that. Albert Barnes, should I say something about him?
Please.
Albert Barnes was a strange man of marked ability, but of rather violent temper, who had made his way as a student of chemistry in both this country and in Germany. I seem to remember that he had made a considerable sum of money selling American stoves in Germany. But he had done graduate work in chemistry at one or more German universities. And on his return, he had discovered argyro. And he decided to take a patent out on this and to manufacture and bottle it and distribute it himself. By 1918, he had already amassed a very considerable fortune. He was living in a large house near Philadelphia and devoting a good deal of his time to the collection of post-impressionist French paintings. His walls were almost covered with Cézannes, Matisses, and Renoirs, which he had picked up at astonishingly low prices because he had an uncanny gift for predicting what was going to be popular a decade or so later. Well, Barnes was a great enthusiast about Dewey's social philosophy. And toward the end of the academic year, he asked Dewey whether he would like to come down to Philadelphia and attempt to put his social theory in practice. Dewey asked him what he meant, and Barnes explained that there was a large group of Polish immigrants who were forming a kind of cyst in Philadelphia society. They were retaining their old world language, customs, religious belief, educational ideas, to a certain extent, even their native dress, and Barnes asked Dewey if this was the sort of phenomenon that he would be interested in investigating. Dewey said yes, he'd be very much interested. "All right," said Barnes, "come along." Dewey said, "Could I bring some of my graduate students with me?" Barnes said, "Certainly." So he proceeded to purchase a rather nice house on Richmond Street in Philadelphia, in a region which, though not exactly a slum, was in the midst of this relatively un-Americanized Polish community. Dewey selected 4 or 5 graduate students, among whom was my wife, my future wife, Frances Bradshaw, my brother, Paul Blanshard, Erwin Edmund, the future Columbia philosopher, Anzia Jezierska, the Polish novelist, and 1 or 2 local Poles who served as interpreters. This group, with Dewey as their leader, settled down in the house on Richmond Street and devoted themselves to investigating this community. Each member of the group took a different assignment. Dewey's assignment was the political aspect of this community. And almost immediately, he saw that there was a very strong relation between the political convictions of these Poles and what was going on in their home country. If I remember rightly, it was at a time when Paderewski was Prime Minister of Poland. And I seem to remember also that Dewey was very strongly opposed to Paderewski's political line. He thought that the State Department was taking Paderewski too seriously as a spokesman for Polish opinion. And he wrote an 80-page booklet whose purpose was not so much to explain Polish opinion in this community as to bring pressure upon the State Department to alter their policy in a more liberal direction. That pamphlet I have not seen in many years. Until yesterday, I saw a Xerox copy of it in this office. The other members of the group each had his own assignment. My wife studied Polish education. Erwin Edmund's assignment I've forgotten. My own assignment was the religion of this group, and I wrote a little book called The Church and the Polish Immigrant as my account of impressions and conclusions attained during the summer. It's a very bad little book. I should hope that no one would read it. I couldn't complete it because at the time, because I was called into service and went to France with the AEF. It was only after I got my discharge in Britain in July of the next year that I could return to it. So it has the smell of the British Museum about it. Perhaps I should add a word or two about the impressions that the group had of Dewey. We all liked and admired him enormously. He was an incredibly humble man in some respects. He would peck out an article for The Nation or the New Republic on his typewriter in the evening, and bring it down to us at breakfast time to read to us in the morning. And he would gratefully accept the criticisms of us young whippersnappers as if we had been persons of light and leading. He had the same attitude toward those who came to the house to see him. He couldn't somehow conceive of himself as a VIP. I remember that one local clergyman dropped in to see us, which meant to see him, on a Sunday afternoon, and Dewey appeared in his shirt sleeves and suspenders, sat in a rocking chair, and went quietly to sleep, rather to the consternation of the clerical visitor.
Did he interview people in the community?
He did, yes, people who he thought could give him information on the political side. But I don't think that he was very much interested in the, for example, the religious and educational sides, because that was not his specific assignment.
Did the government back this project or any way approve of it?
It did not. As I remember, Dewey's careful and elaborate report had no effect whatever in the State Department. I'm not in a good position to report on that because I didn't follow it up, but I think if there had been important results, I'd have heard of them.
Paderewski was the head of the government in exile, wasn't he, during the war?
I think he was. Now, I don't remember.
He was not in this country.
No.
The genesis of the idea came from Barnes,
Yes.
as far as you know.
Yes, it did. I don't think that Dewey had any antecedent knowledge about this community and would have made the proposal himself.
How long did this project last?
Through the summer. I think we went there in June and broke up toward the end of August.
Was
This is
there any-
1918? The summer of 1918?
This was the
Or
summer of 1918, yes.
Was there any contact with W.I. Thomas during this period?
Well, now I remember that Thomas's study of the poles was discussed by us and was regarded as a very important introduction.
Dewey had known Thomas at Chicago.
He had, yes.
Naniecki was then for some years at the University of Illinois, and his daughter lives in a North Shore suburb of Chicago as a sociologist herself.
Well, I remember that Znaniecki's work was again regarded as very important, and some of us, I remember, spent some time in rapidly reading it before we began this undertaking.
Your brother was in this group too. What was his assignment?
Oh, my brother never got a definite assignment because Mr. Barnes, in typical fashion, fired him very early in the summer. My brother was the only person who had any considerable academic knowledge of sociology, and Barnes was suspicious of any person of that type. He would rather have a fresh, virgin, and even blank mind than a person who had academic prepossessions that he thought might distort our inquiry.
But the purpose, as Barnes stated, it was to study the community and make a report. I mean, was there, what did he view as the end of the experiment?
I think he had in his mind the notion that this cyst ought somehow to be broken up, that these people were forming a somewhat alien community, resistant to the influence of American political thought, American ethics, American business habits, American speech, and so on. And he wanted to know whether there was any peaceable means by which this community could be assimilated into the wider community of Philadelphia.
Does this have any connection with the war that's on at this point?
You mean the First World War?
Yes. I mean, is this? Does he see the Polish community here as in some way a threat to the power of?
That I don't know. I suspect that Barnes was almost as much interested in having Dewey as a near neighbor during the summer as anything else. He and Barnes had been having rather frequent discussions of art as well as sociology. And Barnes' book, what is the title of that book? I forget it at the Art in Painting, it was called, yes. That was deeply influenced by Dewey's reflections on aesthetics.
Would you talk about that a little bit more? How did that influence come about, besides conversations? Or was that it?
I don't know how it came about. I suppose that Barnes had invited Dewey to come down to his Philadelphia house, where these extremely valuable artworks were covered the walls, and where his wealth enabled him to hire an orchestra to play during dinner if he cared to have one. And I suspect they discovered in this way a common interest in art, an interest which at that time I think was just beginning to grow in Dewey. I've forgotten the date of Dewey's artist experience.
1934.
Well then, his aesthetic interests were apparently at a very early stage then. With characteristic generosity, Dewey did regard Barnes as rather an authority on art.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I found it rather difficult to convince myself that was true because Barnes was a very rough and ready type. A man with a violent temper and with very strong prejudices. But somehow or other, Dewey and he saw eye to eye. They were fond of each other. They respected each other.
You recall Dewey wrote two little essays in that book that Barnes put out and edited, as I recall, Art Education. There were, I believe, two pieces in there, but I don't remember the date of that.
No, I can't remember either of that.
Whether that came before Barnes wrote the Art and Painting or not, because I always took that book to be an example of the extension of Dewey's work in aesthetics.
Yes. Well, I don't know the dates of these earlier writings of Dewey on aesthetics. I never supposed when I was working with Dewey that he had any particular interest in aesthetics at all.
What was the class you took with him?
Well, I took several classes. One was a seminar in types of logical theory, which ran throughout the year. The other was a class open to both graduates and undergraduates in social and political philosophy, in which Dewey spent a good deal of time on such writers as Bentham.
You see, that came out in 29.
Oh, yes. Well, that again would be after, a good while after our summer. This course in
I'm Mr. Axtell.
oh, how do you do, sir?
Very happy to meet you. I know your brother quite well.
Oh, yes.
We worked together on other things.
Yes.
How do you explain this, something that you said a while ago is something that we've heard from other people, that when Dewey was lecturing, he didn't seem to be particularly coherent, but on reflection and reading of your notes, the scheme became apparent then. How do you explain this as a phenomenon?
Well, in this way, I think, Dewey obviously had thought through the position that he was elaborating in his lectures before coming to class, but he used almost no notes. He spoke quite slowly, and he was evidently thinking his position through again as he spoke. So that although this slowness of speech did suggest to his students that he was groping, in a sense, for ideas as well as words, he wasn't. He was thinking through a position which was already clear in his own mind. So, as we took down our notes, interesting ourselves chiefly in the main headings, they did all hang together and represent the kind of thinking that he'd done before coming to class. He was very ingenious in answering questions. You may be interested in one little leaf that comes falling from the tree. He was lecturing on instrumentalism in logic when someone in the class, it may have been Irwin Edmund, who was likely to raise this kind of difficulty, said, "Mr. Dewey, do you really think that Kant, when he sat down in the evening and looked off at that church steeple and began to think about freedom of the will, was using his thought simply as an instrument to reach some practical end? Wasn't he thinking for the sake of truth and truth only?" Dewey stopped and thought for a moment about the question, and then said something like this: "I think Kant was thinking in order to achieve some practical end. In fact, the thought of the metaphysician is rather like the behavior of the athlete. If the football player were interested simply in getting that football as such, beyond the goalposts as such, he'd get up some dark night and put it there. His interest is in overcoming the opposition in accordance with the recognized rules of the game." Now that was essentially what Kant was doing. He was thinking in accordance with the established rules of the logical game, and he was trying to outplay all his rivals at this game. Being a person of no physical prowess, without particular business interests, he was the sort of person who could achieve his niche in the world only by his expertness and acumen in outplaying his rivals. And this was the way in which, in somewhat Freudian fashion, he achieved security, self-respect, and success. Now, I thought that was an ingenious, extremely ingenious explanation, which was entirely perverse. I didn't believe it at all, and yet it expressed Dewey's ability to take an objection, which was, I think, a very pointed and sound one, and explain it in his own terms.
Dr. Blanshard, I wonder if the conception of instrumentalism couldn't be also framed in terms of the conception of functionalism, as ideas have functions to perform. Now, the reason, one objection probably to the notion of instrumentalism is that it's so confused with a narrow sense of practice, whereas a sense of functionalism seems to me is free of that kind of difficulty. They have functions to perform.
Yes. Well, I don't think myself that Dewey was ever very clear as to the relation between the intellectual function of an idea and the practical function of it. And I think that that difficulty comes out quite clearly in the chapter in The Quest for Certainty, in which he attempts to explain why it is that pure mathematicians pursue so apparently perverse and impractical an interest as mathematical theorization. I don't think myself that his answer to a person like Russell is a very convincing answer. Russell would say that when he was developing his mathematics, he was interested in mathematics for its own sake. He was interested in it as a system which somehow reflected the structure of the real world. Dewey, I take it, would deny that that is the real interest of the mathematician. He would say that if you could prove that there would never be a practical application for a given mathematical theory, then it would be what Mr. Barnes used to call, with Dewey's encouragement, autistic thinking that the man was engaged in. He was simply thinking into the inane.
And yet it has, his operations have practical value in terms of what he's concerned about, is concerned about the theory.
Well, Dewey did take that line sometimes to the distress of people like Montague and me, because it seemed to me that that if you admit that there is such a thing as a purely theoretical interest in truth as such, then you have really abandoned the most distinctive thing about pragmatism or instrumentalism.
Well, this is why I suggest the term functional,
Yes.
as opposed to instrumental.
Well, now, I doubt whether one can reconcile the line that Dewey took in his Japanese lectures on the reconstruction of philosophy with that interpretation of functionalism. Because when he came to discuss the Greeks, who he thought had put philosophy off on the wrong line, because of the interest of people like Plato and Aristotle in pure theory, he did seem to say that that was an improper function for philosophy to perform. That in the Greek days, philosophy was simply the function of the aristocrat, the activity of the aristocrat, who didn't feel responsible for work with his hands or for social reform or anything but knowing truth as such. And Dewey, as I understand it, deprecated that kind of activity and that conception of philosophy.
Well, now, in his philosophy of civilization, he would say, well, they were performing a function, functional philosophy in that, within respect to that civilization. I don't get the sense that that what he would say, I would think, would be, well, they would be performing a function that would be putting us off on the wrong foot if we did it. But I think that because, after all, he does say that they made the greatest invention that's ever been made. He didn't choose the word, but might say the word theory.
Well, you know, perhaps you can help me out on this. My feeling is that if Dewey was equally willing to recognize the pure theorizing of an Aristotle or a Russell or a Whitehead as an exemplification of what he meant by function in philosophy, then pragmatism is not distinct from any other philosophy, because we all recognize that there is this kind of intellectual function. And I thought that if pragmatism is going to stand for a distinct theory of thought, it would take the line that an idea or a hypothesis is, as Dewey said, at least in his early writings, a plan of action. And Aristotle's or Russell certainly would not say that in his own theorizing he was attempting to adopt plans of action which would be tested in practice.
Well, in the first place, I think he would still say that there's a plan of action, even at this metaphysical level. But in almost the last page of essays in experimental logic, he makes a statement that of all modes of practice, theory is the most practical. Now,
Now, what does he mean
I
by
get
this,
the
Rachel?
sense.
I wish you'd explain to me what he means by when he says.
Well, I think
that.
he would. I think by that he meant that this had the largest and widest range of applicability. It seems to me that I don't think that Dewey would have any difficulty at all in esteeming the work of a Russell or an Aristotle. He would interpret it. He would interpret what was happening differently than they would. But I think in terms of, I think he would grant that in terms of the resources, the intellectual resources available at the time of Aristotle, he did the best that could be done. And in terms of his culture, it was an expression of that culture. And this, I think, is all that he. Whenever he's criticizing a philosophy, it's not. It seems to me, in terms of saying, "Well, this is a great mistake," I don't think this has ever been implicit in his criticism, but rather as a dialectic in order to interpret what he thinks is a philosophy that would be relevant to our own time. Well, I'm sorry,
perhaps we can bring this back to your experience.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
To the matter of the course you had in types of logical theory. Do you remember much about that course?
I don't. I have my notes at home, and I could have said something more interesting about it if I had known that I was going to have this opportunity.
Yeah.
I remember that Dewey paid particular attention to Lotze, whom he regarded as a very distinguished logician. And my later reading of Lotze has convinced me that he was right about that. He also paid a good deal of attention to Bosanquet, who was much more in the public eye then than he is now.
What about Bradley?
He had great respect for Bradley. You may be interested to know that when I met Bradley a little later, in 1920, the conversation fell on Dewey for a moment, and Bradley expressed much interest in and respect for Dewey. He also said something about Bosanquet, which I thought was very interesting. He had the greatest respect for Bosanquet, but felt that Bosanquet's lamentable style had prevented his achieving the influence that he might have had. Of course, Bradley was himself a great stylist, and I think that part of his difficulty with both Dewey and Bosanquet was that they fell so far below what he would regard as the right standard in writing.
The course you had in social and political, also, you said he spent a great deal of time on Bentham. Now, when he wrote The Public and Its Problems, later, he has some very glowing accounts of Bentham and appreciation of Bentham in that book. You remember anything that he said about Bentham in that course?
I wish I could, but it's
You have
gone
notes.
down
You have
the
notes
drain.
from all the courses.
Yes, I do. I could easily bring them to light by rummaging in my attic. I have my wife's notes also. She sat in on more courses of Dewey than I did.
Yeah, wouldn't it be marvelous if we could have Xerox copies of these things?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I could easily dig them up.
I was coming to that.
Yeah.
I was coming to that.
You, after your discharge then from the Army in Great Britain, you returned to this country. Did you see Dewey then at this time?
No, I lost touch with him almost completely because on my return I went to Harvard and worked there until I took my doctorate and then went out to Michigan, where memories of Dewey still lurked in corners about the place. But I had almost no contact with him from that time on.
Did you correspond with him?
I have one or two of his letters, yes. I've forgotten what they were about. They were of no particular value because they were very brief notes and did not, I think, contain any philosophical discussion.
Did you know any of the Dewey family?
No, I never met any of them. Mrs. Dewey was about in those days, but I never went to any of the sessions at their apartment.
Now, you were telling me last night about Dewey and Russell.
Yes.
Now, were you there on the scene when all this took place, where Dewey defended Russell, and were you close enough to that give us some first-hand
I don't think
accounts?
I could say anything that isn't already well known. I was told that after Russell's denial of his post at City College, Dewey became much concerned about Russell's future. He was left without the post that had been promised him, and Dewey was concerned that he should be able to continue his writing and thinking. So he saw Mr. Barnes again and intervened on Russell's behalf. And as I understand, it was because of Dewey's intervention that Barnes, who had very little in common with Russell, employed him at the art center that he'd established in Marion, just outside Philadelphia. Barnes established the Russells, the third Lady Russell, who was with him at the time, in a beautiful stone house just outside Bryn Mawr. And Russell invited the Moores and my wife and myself to come over and see them one day. Moore was, I may add parenthetically, characteristically indisposed that day and didn't go with us. I think that they had long ago reached the parting of the ways. They were temperamentally rather unsympathetic with each other, although they had so much in common intellectually. But the three others of us did go. And if I may add a little irrelevance here, when I got there, Russell took me into his study and pointed out a silhouette on the wall and asked me whether I could identify it. I looked at it carefully and was rather chagrined to find that I had no idea who it was, although I rather pride myself on being able to recall what most of the eminent philosophers looked like. And he said, well, that's my godfather, John Stuart Mill. Of course, Mill died in 1873. Russell was born in 1872. And Russell's father, who was a great admirer of Mill, had asked Mill to serve, so far as an agnostic could serve, as the godfather to his baby, and Mill had consented. Russell was at that time, I think, writing the chapter on William James in his History of Western Philosophy. I recall only one remark he made, which I suspect he would have made about Dewey, as well as about James. A remark made about James's will to believe. He exclaimed to me, "Isn't it immoral?"
Do you recall any other of the things that might have happened that afternoon at this meeting?
That's all that comes back. Unfortunately, I haven't kept any diary or journal. I regret it now, because G.E. Moore, chiefly because G.E. Moore lived in my house for 6 months during the last war, and I had walks and talks with him almost daily during that time. And I do wish I'd kept some record of them, because Moore was an extraordinarily penetrating thinker who used to flatten me in almost every argument we had. And I wish I had kept notes of those discussions. Incidentally, Dewey and Moore were at opposite poles from each other, personally. Moore didn't want to talk philosophy unless he did it with his Prince Albert on, so to speak. Do it with full professional responsibility, insisting that you use the various terms precisely. And by that, he usually meant as he used them. He wasn't much interested in making casual comments on the war, or on politics, or on art, or literature. I found it very difficult to get him to describe personalities, although he knew many of the most distinguished personalities in the Britain of his time.
Mr. Russell would call you on that.
He would say casually, for example, I used to know Leonard and Virginia Woolf very well. And I'd say, "Oh, did you? Well, what was Virginia like?" And he'd say, "Well, she was a very intelligent woman." And there the conversation would drop. He was not... I asked him whether he knew Lytton Strachey. "Oh, yes, Lytton Strachey used to come to my room and ask me to play and sing Schubert for him." And there the conversation. Now, Dewey was just the opposite of that. I don't mean that Dewey was interested in personalities. I don't think he was. He was one of the most impersonal of minds, as I recall. Not interested in gossip at all, for example. But he was interested in an enormous variety of things. He would talk easily about education, or art, or current politics, or the war, or anything else of the type. He was more like Whitehead in that respect than like Moore. His interest was really Catholic, and he could talk about a great variety of subjects with great understanding and acute perception.
And do you know anything about his reading habits? When did he do his reading, and did he read a long stretch or little short pieces?
I can't answer that question. During the summer, he did not, I think, do much reading because he was so engaged in interviewing people and writing articles for journals and pursuing his own lines of reflection in his room. So I know nothing about his reading habits.
He didn't participate then in sessions in the evening, sitting around the living room?
No, there wasn't much of that. He wasn't a voluble person. He was quite ready to answer questions if they were put to him, but I don't think he was the sort of person who liked to get together a group and put on his slippers and have his talk out. No, he was interested in thinking his own thoughts and writing them down, I think, rather than engaging in random conversation.
Do you recall any conversations you might have had or any incidents that surrounded the dispute that he had with Randolph Bourne?
No, I remember hearing him remark that Bourne was a rather sad case because he was crippled, and that put the persons who were engaged in argument with him at some disadvantage. At least I thought that Dewey was implying that, but that's the only echo I have of that dispute.
Following in the same line, did you ever see him at any time react when he might have felt he was under criticism or under stress in some way?
I never did. No, I think that he was unusually unlikely to take criticisms of him personally. And my feeling is that he was almost single-mindedly interested in whether the argument offered by someone is valid or not, and singularly uninterested in the status of this person. It didn't make much difference to Dewey whether the objection to him was offered by a graduate student or a distinguished philosopher. He was looking at the validity of the point made. His absence of dramatic sense appeared one evening in a way that struck me very forcibly. John Coss, who was chairman of the department at Columbia in those days, arranged a session on the teaching of philosophy. And he called on a number of rather distinguished persons in the Columbia faculty to participate in it, which they did. He asked Dewey to attend, and he reserved Dewey for the dessert. Dewey was going to be the really important figure. When finally Coss did call upon Dewey, Dewey said, "Well, I've always thought that if you're going to teach logic, the best thing to do would be to begin with fallacies." And there he stopped, as I remember. And well, I have no doubt that he was drawn out in some way by further questions. But it struck me as so typical of his own sense, his own lack of feeling that he was an important and distinguished figure, that he felt that it was all right if he just made a single casual observation and let matters drop.
How about his sense of humor?
I don't think he had much. At least he had none of the wit that Russell had. Now Russell was always adorning his conversations with little salty bits of witticism, sometimes, in fact rather frequently, acid. But Dewey's conversations never, as I remember, interspersed with that kind of thing.
On the matter
Did Dewey play in the broader sense? This summer you spent in Philadelphia. Did he play cards? Did he play checkers?
I don't remember that he ever did it. I don't know that Dewey ever, for example, played golf or played tennis or did he seemed a singularly unathletic type.
Was he playful in relations with people?
No, I should
No.
say not. He did, some years after this, take up with a man named Alexander,
Yeah.
who was very much interested in the study of physical posture. He thought most of us had allowed our posture to become very far from what it ought to be. Dewey went to him, was treated by him, and received, and was very much helped by him, so that he was ready to give some very warm recommendations to this man Alexander, recommendations that I gathered from other people were very valuable to Alexander, but estimated him too high, because other medical practitioners, for example, didn't think much of Alexander.
Helped in what way? Did Dewey find himself in ill health at this point? Or?
Yes, he did. I don't know exactly what was wrong, but whatever it was greatly helped by Alexander's attempts to get him to adopt a different physical posture, different way of walking, I think.
It's interesting that his secretary's comments suggest that the same thing in his earlier years, but in his later years he became quite playful. And Sattel, whom we had here, you know, suggests the same thing, that in his later years he was really quite playful socially.
And Sing-Nan Fenn reports of his playing with the second brood of children on the floor, rolling with them and so on, in the Fifth Avenue apartment.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that was a side of
Literally on
Dewey
the
that I
floor.
never had an opportunity to know. I was, of course, told the story about Dewey, that he once observed water coming through the ceiling in his own home or apartment, and went upstairs and found that his little son, I suppose it was this boy, had turned on the tap and the tub had run over, and Dewey expressed astonishment, and the little boy said, "Now, John, keep your shirt on."
On the matter of taking criticism, you may have heard the same story. From whence it's come, I don't now recall. But it was the evening that Mortimer Adler delivered that famous charge to the effect that we had more to fear from the, what was the phrase he used? The atheistic professors than we do from Hitler. And the story has it that he was quite distressed about it and left the room, if I remember the story correctly. Do you have any memory of this?
None at all.
incident?
No, I must have been away from Columbia at that time.
Did Dewey make any political speeches during the summer in Philadelphia?
I don't remember that he did.
Did you ever on occasion see him in a public way other than in a classroom? So that
He used to come to the meetings of the Philosophy Club, which were held rather frequently. And it just comes back to me now, I haven't thought of it in a very long time, a passage at arms between him and Montague. Montague, if I remember rightly, counted himself as a kind of materialist, but a materialist who believed in free will. Dewey would not call himself a materialist, I think, although he was a naturalist, of course, but he did not believe, I take it, in free will in the sense of being a libertarian. And I remember that when Montague reported his view to this colloquium, Dewey was evidently and distinctly angry about it. But what he said to Montague, I've completely forgotten.
Why was he angry?
I suppose because he felt that it was so perverse of a person who called himself a materialist to be anything but a determinist.
Would be confused, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would, and I think it is very odd to combine those two positions.
Did he ever allow his students to bait him? Or did they ever attempt to bait him?
Well, they raised frequent questions in his lectures, and apparently he always welcomed an intervention from them. But can't recall that he was ever irritated or ever dealt with them wittily. He would deal with them soberly and reflectively.
Are there any other questions?
I have one question, and that is Dewey's popularity in philosophy has declined somewhat. Do you have any comments on the ebb and flow of Dewey's influence?
Well, in a rather curious way, Dewey is not unpopular with the positivists. And I think the reason for that is that he placed so much stress upon verifiability in practice of hypotheses, either philosophic or scientific. I think that Reichenbach used to respect Dewey a good deal. Dewey and Reichenbach both believed that the theory was meaningless unless it was capable of some sort of straightforward verification and experience. And while I think that they didn't mean by verification quite the same things, it is worth noting that a good many of the positivists were willing to accept Dewey much more readily than they would accept people like Bradley or Royce. It was largely due, I think, to the similarity in the theory of meaning and the theory of verification that they accepted.
Do you recall any Dewey defense of his interest in education? Do you remember in his autobiography he complained because men in general philosophy had not read his Democracy and Education. Do you recall his ever talking at this at all?
No, I don't. I've forgotten the date of Democracy and Education.
1916.
1916. Well, he just recently completed that then during the summer that at the time that I knew him. No, he didn't talk much about that. No, I wish I had something to add on that point, but and no doubt he did say many things in his lectures that, if I could recall them, would be relevant, but I can't. About Dewey's influence on later philosophy and the fluctuations of his reputation, once more, I just don't know the facts about them. I think that he was very much perturbed to find that his Democracy and Education was charged with having been the source of many things in what's called progressive education that he would cordially have disapproved. He certainly didn't believe in leaving students perfectly free to follow their own impulses.
Of course, he expressed this in his later little experience in education.
Yes. I think that anyone who reads Dewey's Democracy and Education, which is the only thing in the way of educational writing that I studied carefully,